Okay, this recording is on it's on Module 3, the integumentary system. And we'll just be covering the first part of the integumentary system in this video, and we'll finish up the rest next week in class. So the integumentary system includes the skin. And then in addition to that, it includes the glands that we learned about in the last chapter. So the apocrine glands, the merocrine glands, and the holocrine glands. And then it includes hair and nails. We won't say a lot about hair or nails today. We'll do a little bit of that next week. Okay, so starting with the skin, if you will look at figure 3.1, this is a drawing of the skin. So let me point out a few things. So the epidermis is the outermost layer, and as we learned when we studied tissue, the epidermis is stratified, squamous epithelial tissue, okay? Then the layer underneath that is called the dermis, and the dermis is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. So it's the deeper layer of the skin. Well, underneath the dermis is another layer that is called the hypodermis. It's not in this slide, but we'll see it in another one. So it's called the hypodermis. And so hypo means under, and it is not part of the skin. But what it does is it attaches, so it would be here, and it then attaches the skin to whatever is underneath it, the bone or the muscle that is underneath it. Okay, then if we look at, let's look more closely then at the dermis. So let me erase this. So the dermis, you can see on this left side, the dermis is comprised of two layers. It is comprised, so this is all dermis over here. This is dermis. So the dermis is made up of two layers. There's a very thin layer at the top called the papillary layer. And then the larger layer is called the reticular layer. And the thing I want to point out about the papillary layer is that if you see in here, and I'll try to trace these, if you see in here, you notice that the papillary layer is made up of these what are called dermal papillae, and they're basically just small bumps. And what the purpose that the papillary layer serves is that it helps to bring these red things are blood vessels. So it helps to bring the blood vessels, you can see because of that papillary layer and those dermal papillae, it helps to bring the blood vessels closer to the dermis. So remember when we learned about tissue, we learned that the epidermis does not have a blood supply. So these dermal papillae help to bring that blood supply closer to the dermis. The other thing that you see in the epidermis is so also within the epidermis, and again, we don't show that on this picture, but I do want to point out to you that within the epidermis are these things that are called epidermal ridges. And the epidermal ridges are the basis that we have for fingerprinting. So you may or may not know, some of you who took forensic science know that fingerprints are a better identification even than DNA, because identical twins have the same DNA, but they have different fingerprints. So these epidermal ridges, in terms of their purpose, they help to increase the friction between surfaces. So that's what allows us to grasp things with our fingers and they don't slip away because of these epidermal ridges. The bumps or these bumps or ridges actually are in the dermis, but they show up through the epidermis. And then they have the other useful function. Besides creating friction, they can be used for identification because they are unique to each individual. If we look at this second layer then of the dermis, the reticular layer, what the reticular layer is made of is that it is made up of a network of collagen fibers. And remember, we learned about collagen when we were looking at connective tissue. So again, we said it's dense, irregular connective tissue. And because the collagen goes through the dermis in all different directions, it's dense, irregular. So the collagen is oriented in all directions, and that's what gives skin its strength in all directions. So it's not strong just in one dimension, but it's strong in all of the dimensions because of these collagen fibers that go through it in all different directions. Okay, then if you can look now at figure 3.3. So again, in this figure, you should be able to locate the epidermis, the very top layer, and then the dermis, which is made up of here's the papillary layer, and then not labeled here, but underneath would be the reticular layer. And then this figure does show the hypodermis. Okay, so you can see all of this yellow stuff here, that's all fat tissue, it's all adipose tissue. So the hypodermis is underneath the dermis, and as I said previously, it's not part of the skin, but it's underneath the skin, and it would then attach the skin to muscle or bone. Okay, so on this figure, I'd like for you to notice the nerves. So those are labeled here as these yellow structures. So they're yellow, but I'm going to make them nice and red for you. So these are the nerves. And there would be many more nerves in here, but they've drawn just a few just to illustrate them. So these nerves, there are many receptors in the skin that send information from the skin to the brain and the spinal cord. So these nerves that are in the skin would receive the information from those receptors and then send the information to the brain and spinal cord. A couple of things you'll notice about these nerves. One is that, so this is here in the middle right here is a hair follicle. And you'll notice here that this nerve actually touches that hair follicle. So this part of the hair up here is dead. So it doesn't feel anything. But if your hair is pulled, or if it's blown by the wind, you do feel that. And the reason that you feel it is because these neurons that are in the dermis, so these nerve fibers that are in the nervous or in the dermis, send a signal to the brain that your hair is being pulled. So even though this shaft of the hair is dead and doesn't have any feeling, the fact that these nerves are attached to the hair follicle allows us to feel our hair being pulled or feel our hair being blown in the wind, even though this part of the hair you can cut and you can't feel that at all. So the types of receptors that take information to the brain, let's go back to it. So there are many receptors in the skin. And next week during class, we're going to actually do some activities where we will look at those different receptors. But they're called sensory receptors because they take the messages to the brain. So they sense changes in the skin and carry that information to the brain. So these sensory receptors respond to things like temperature. They'll respond to touch or pressure. Some of them respond to pain. Some of them respond to itch. Oh, not itch. Okay, so sensory receptors, there are many, many sensory receptors within the skin. So if we go back to this figure that we were looking at then, I also want to point out a muscle that we see here. So this is a muscle, and several things. One, you'll notice that muscle does have a nerve supply, so there's nerves going to that muscle, but also this muscle is attached to the hair follicle. So it's a smooth muscle. We haven't learned about muscle yet, but you know that one type of muscle is smooth muscle. So that muscle that you see there is a smooth muscle, and it is called, actually here, erector pili muscle. So when this muscle contracts, it pulls on the hair follicle. And when it pulls on that hair follicle, then this hair stands on end, and that causes a little bump in your skin, and that's what we call a goose bump. So these are erector pili muscles pulling on the hair follicle causes the hair to stand on end, and it causes that little bump. And the hair standing on end, when you get multiples of these hairs standing on end, they actually trap warm air in there, and they help to retain heat. So you know that we get goosebumps when it's cold, and then the response to that helps to warm the surface of the skin again. And it's the erector pili muscle that is attached to the hair follicle. So this hypodermis, as I said, is not part of the skin. So it is comprised, as I said, of adipose tissue, which we see a lot of here. And then it is also comprised of loose connective tissue. So adipose tissue and loose connective tissue make up the hypodermis. And it serves several purposes. It provides some insulation, so for warmth and retaining heat. It also serves as some padding between the skin and the muscle or bone that is underneath. Okay, another thing that you should notice in this figure is, I'm going to circle it here with red, and that is a sweat gland. So here, this part down here is the sweat gland, and then we have the sweat duct that comes out and empties onto the skin. So let's go ahead and review the types of, last time we learned that sweat glands are Marroquin glands. So there are sweat glands that are found over most of your skin, and they are Marroquin glands. So they just secrete sweat. There's no cell parts in the sweat that is secreted. So no cell parts. Remember, some types of glands secrete either a part of the cell or an entire cell. There are no cells secreted, it's just sweat. So most of the sweat glands in your skin are Marroquin sweat glands that secrete sweat onto the skin, onto the surface of the skin. Now, and as you may know that the purpose that sweat serves is that when sweat evaporates, there is a lot of heat that is lost. So that helps to cool the body. And it really is a lot of heat. So if for every liter of sweat that is evaporated, the sweat has to be evaporated in order for it to serve a cooling function. But for every liter of sweat that is evaporated, your body will lose 580 calories of heat. So that's a lot of heat that is lost through the evaporation of sweat. And that would be the evaporation of sweat through these merocrine glands that are illustrated here that I circled in red. There is another type of sweat gland that this is going to be, it will sound a little bit confusing, but we call them apocrine glands, but they are really, they're really merocrine glands, but they were misnamed, and the misnaming has been retained. So they are really merocrine glands. So they only secrete sweat. They don't secrete any part of the cell, but they are different because these are the glands that are located in the area of the armpit and the area of the groin. And what is different about them is that they are found either near or in the hypodermis. So they can be in the dermis, but they would be in the deep part of the dermis, or they are actually in the hypodermis itself. And what is unique about these, and you know this from personal experience, is that the sweat in these areas produces a strong odor. So, you know, when you reach puberty and you have to start wearing deodorant, it's because of these, we call them apocrine glands. They're really merocrine glands, but in these areas, a strong odor is produced by the sweat in these areas. So the other thing that is different about them is that they do not empty directly onto the skin, but they empty into a hair follicle, and then from that hair follicle they empty out onto the skin. They empty into a hair follicle, and then from the hair follicle, then they go out onto the surface of the skin. And we'll look at a figure of that in just a minute. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the figure. So, well, let's see, maybe we don't have that on here. Yeah, I guess it actually doesn't show that on this figure, but if it were what we refer to as the apocrine glands, it would be down here, you know, toward the bottom of the dermis, or even in the hypodermis, and then the glands, the duct would carry that into a hair follicle, and then from the hair follicle it would empty out onto the skin. So the true the merocrine glands that are true merocrine glands, those are only present in the dermis, whereas what we call apocrine glands can also be in the hypodermis. Okay, then the last thing to talk about on this figure is this thing right here that is called a sebaceous gland. And you may remember from last chapter that the sebaceous gland is a holocrine gland. So remember that that means that they secrete an entire cell into their secretion. So they secrete an entire cell. And it's an epithelial cell. And they also often will kind of open up into a hair follicle. So that's what you see here. So here's the sebaceous gland, and the gland empties into the hair follicle, and they secrete this oil then onto the skin. The oil that they secrete is called sebum, S-E-B-U-M. So that's the oil from a sebaceous gland. And it helps to soften the skin and hair, and it also serves as a protective barrier against harmful bacteria. So the sebaceous gland is a type of holocrine gland. Okay, I think that's all we need to say about this particular figure. Okay, now let's switch to the next figure. Okay, so figure 3.4, this figure shows the different layers of the epidermis. Okay, so that very top layer of the skin is actually comprised of 5 different layers. So just to orient you here, so all this pink stuff underneath here, all this down here would be dermis, right? So you can, because you can see these dermal papillae here that help to get their little grooves that go up into the dermis and help to bring the blood supply closer to the dermis. Okay, so all of this would be the dermis, and then everything above that is part of the epidermis. So let's start talking about the layers of the epidermis. So again, if we orient ourselves, so the down here are the deep layers. So this is the deep layer, and then when you get up toward the top, this is the part of the skin that is actually on the very surface. Okay, so deep down here, and the surface of the skin would be up here. Okay, so the deepest layer is called the stratum basale. Stratum basale. So we're going to go deep to superficial. So the first one is called the stratum basale. So this is the deepest layer of the epithelium. And the most important thing to remember about the stratum basale is that in this layer, the cells are constantly doing mitosis. And then once so they're constantly reproducing themselves, and as they reproduce, then they get pushed up into the next layer. And that next layer is called the stratum spinosum. And the stratum spinosum also does mitosis. So the two bottom layers of the epidermis are the two layers that do mitosis. Let me say, I'll go ahead and erase this top part. Let me say a couple more things about these two layers. So in addition to the fact that they do mitosis, these two layers also contain melanocytes. So use that word sites, which remember this, it just means cell. And melano means that they make melanin. These cells are especially located near the stratum basale, but there are some also in the stratum spinosum. And the melanin is what gives our skin color. And actually what happens is that the melanocytes make the melanin, and then it gets packaged in Golgi bodies. Remember we said that Golgi bodies is kind of like a packaging system in the cell so that then things can get sent out. So from the Golgi bodies, then it gets sent outward into these extensions that come off the cells. And then the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum actually engulf them. So you have these little packages that are full of melanin. And the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum actually engulf them by a process that's called phagocytosis, which basically just means it's like an eating motion. So it engulfs the cells in that, the epithelial cells engulf these packets of melanin, and so they're basically eating these little vesicles that are full of melanin, and then that is what gives the skin color. There's actually two types of melanin. I don't expect you to know this, but there's U melanin, which has a darker color, and then there is pheomelanin, which is lighter or kind of a more reddish color. And so depending on the distribution of those, the type of melanin, that determines the skin color. The thing about skin color is that almost all skin colors have about the same number of melanocytes, but the darker skin colors, their melanocytes just make more melanin. And lighter skin types, the melanocytes make less melanin. But in terms of numbers of cells, they are very similar in all skin colors. The other thing that melanin does is that it helps to protect against ultraviolet light, so UV light. And so that is why people with light colored skin have to be more careful about sun exposure, because their skin doesn't contain as much melanin, so they don't have as strong a protection against ultraviolet light. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our figure. So, so the first two layers, the deepest layer is the stratum basale, and then the layer next to that is the stratum spinosum. Both layers contain melanocytes, and both layers do mitosis, and then as they are reproducing cells, those cells get pushed upward into the other layers. So then the third layer, if we're going closer, as we go closer to the surface, the third layer is called the stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum, and it is in this layer that the cells begin to die. So the epithelial cells begin to die. And it is also this layer that produces a protein that is called keratin. And what does keratin do? Well, it basically waterproofs your skin. So it repels water from the outside, and it keeps water inside from evaporating. So that keratin is important for retaining water in the skin, but also keeping too much water from getting in, so that our skin just doesn't bloat with water. Okay, so stratum granulosum is the third layer, moving deep to the surface. Okay, then the next layer is called the stratum lucidum. And by the time the cells get into the stratum lucidum, they are mostly dead. So they start to die in the stratum granulosum, and then by the time they get to the stratum lucidum, they are mostly dead. Get that P in there. You do not find the stratum lucidum throughout the body. stratum lucidum is found only in what is referred to as thick skin. And that means those areas that tend to get a lot of pressure applied to them. So this is the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So stratum lucidum is not in all of the layers. Okay, then the top layer is called the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum is actually about 25 layers of dead cells. And those dead cells also have keratin. So these cells are just flaking off. They're dead and they just gradually flaking off the surface. So let's go back to our figure. So here's the top layer, the stratum corneum. So basically, as the cells travel up from the stratum basale to the stratum spinosum to the stratum granulosum, and if there is a stratum lucidum, go into that area, and then finally into the stratum corneum. As they travel up through these layers, they are slowly dying, so that by the time the cells reach the stratum corneum, they flake off and they have to be replaced by new cells that have traveled that same pathway, that have started in the stratum basale where mitosis is taking place and moving up through the layers. So thin skin does not have the stratum lucidum. And if we look at thin skin, besides not having a stratum lucidum, all these other layers are also thinner, so they don't have as many layers as they do in thick skin. So thick skin is found where you get a lot of pressure or a lot of friction, and that would contain the stratum lucidum, and each of these other layers would also contain more layers within that layer. Okay, so let's just quickly summarize then. So this area down here is all the dermis, loose connective tissue, loose irregular connective tissue, and within that we have these dermal papillae that kind of bump up into the epidermis. And then the 5 layers of the epidermis are the stratum basale, stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, which is found only in thick skin, and then lastly the stratum corneum. And these 2 layers do mitosis, and as those new cells are produced, they're just pushed up into the next layer, and they slowly die, so that by the time you get to the stratum corneum, you just have 25 to 30 layers of dead skin cells that are just constantly flaking off every time we touch something or rub against something. So that is what we were going to cover in class on Tuesday. We were going to do some activities related to receptors in the skin, and we'll try to get as many of those done next week in class as we can.